Chapter 65. July rode for days without seeing any person, or for that matter, many signs of life except the hawks and buzzards circling in the blue prairie sky. Once he saw a wolf loping along the ridge, and at night he heard coyotes, but the only game he saw were jackrabbits, and it was mostly rabbit he ate. He kept going north, reminding himself that it was a long way to any towns, but soon the unvarying emptiness of the country began to disturb him, and he was already disturbed enough by the deaths of the 3 people buried on the Canadian. He thought of them more or less all day. Waking in the gray dawn, he would have Roscoe's face in his mind. When he dreamed, it was of Roscoe and Joe and the young girl. Several times he cried at the thought of the finality of it. He had a longing to get them back in places they belonged. Fort Smith, in the case of Roscoe and Joe. He didn't know where the girl had belonged, though it wasn't in a grave on the Canadian. What he was doing, indeed, his whole life now seemed to him completely futile. He rode through the empty land without hope of anything, simply going on because he had something to do. As he went farther and farther onto the plains, he ceased to be able to imagine Fort Smith as a place where he might ever live and work again. What would he do if he did go back? Sit in the jail where he had worked with Roscoe, or in the cabin where he had lived with Elmira? July didn't see how things could get worse, since he had lost his wife and led 3 people to their deaths. But 4 days after he left Augustus, his horse went lame. Some small, spiky cactus hidden by the trail prairie grass proved more deadly than a snake. A thorn worked its way far into the horse's hoof. July had to tie the horse down to get the thorn out, and even then he was not sure he had got it all. They were 3 days north of the Cimarron when it happened. Water was scarce, and the horse soon too lame to ride. He led the horse, taking it slow, hoping the hoof would get better, but it did no good. The horse was lamed and could put no weight on the hoof at all. Finally, sadly, feeling that he was parting with his last companion in life, July unsaddled the horse and shot him. He left his saddle, but took his rifle and started walking east. The next day, from a ridge, he saw a great cloud of buzzards over the place where the horse lay. The sight made him cry. He walked all day, hoping to cross a creek, but finding none. He had half a canteen of water, not enough to get him back to the Cimarron. He had nothing to eat. He made a dry camp and sat all night on his blanket, so wakeful he thought he would never sleep again. He sat for hours, watching the moon climb high amid the bright stars. He remembered the cold nights in their Arkansas cabin when he was a boy, how his mother piled quilts on top of him and his brothers, how peaceful it seemed under the quilts. Then it seemed like sleep was one of the most wonderful things in life. July wondered if perhaps the sleep of death would be as good, as comforting and warming as his boyhood slumber. He had a rifle and a pistol. One pull of the trigger would bring him all the sleep he wanted. In his 5 years as a lawman, he had never shot anyone, though he had a reputation as a dangerous fighter. It would be a joke on everyone if the only person he ever killed was himself. He had always assumed that people who killed themselves were cowards. His own uncle had done it in a painful way by drinking lye. His uncle had been in deep in debt. Now as he sat and watched the moon, killing himself merely seemed sensible. His life had been ruined, surprisingly, inexplicably, swiftly, but ruined for sure. He had made wrong choices all along, and it had cost 3 lives. Killing himself would put at one with Roscoe, Janey, Joe, and the horse. They all started traveling together. It would be fitting that they all entered the same place. He began to think about which gun to use. The barrel of the rifle gleamed in the moonlight. The pistol was heavy in its holster. He took out the pistol and slowly turned the cylinder, listening to the heavy clicks. But he didn't put it to his head. He remembered Elmira. It seemed to him he had to find her to tell her what had happened to her son. It was true she had never seemed fond of the boy. Elmira had never seemed fond of anyone. But Joe had been her son, and she might want to know. July thought all night. Knowing that he had only to raise the pistol eased his mind a little. He had better go and find Elmira first. He wanted to explain to her that he had never meant to do whatever had caused her to run off. Once that was done, he could go off with the pistol and join his dead. The next morning he started walking, but he didn't feel the same. He felt like he no longer belonged to life. It would not have surprised him to see a cloud of buzzards circling over him. In spirit, he had gone to visit Roscoe. He finished his water that night, having walked all day through the brown wavy grass. He tried a long shot at a deer, but missed. The next morning he was awakened by the cawing of crows. He looked up to see several of them flapping overhead in the early grayness. He was tired from his long day's walk and didn't get up immediately. There was nothing to get up for but the bright sun and the shimmering plains. But he kept hearing the crows cawing and quarreling not far away. When he stood up, he saw a little grove of low trees not 200 yards away. They weren't much, but they were trees, and the crows were wrestling in them. Among the trees he found a spring, just a trickle of a spring, but it had formed a shallow pool 10 feet wide. Black Snake was curled on a rock at the water's edge. It was probably what the crows were complaining about. July spent the day by the spring. He drank, bathed, and soaked his dirty clothes, spreading them out on the grass to dry. While he rested, a big badger walked up to the spring, and July shot him with his pistol. He'd never eaten badger, but he ate this one and drank the spring water. Even better than food were the trees. Being in the shade again eased his spirit a little. He could look across the hot prairies for miles from the comfort of his shade. The sun couldn't parch him while he was under the trees. But he couldn't live forever on spring water and one badger. Besides, he had his chore to do. He waited until the cool of the evening, then he set out again. The second day he crossed a wagon track coming from the south. It led him to a running creek, but he saw no wagon. The next day he saw a dust cloud, which turned out to be a small cow herd. The cowboys were mighty surprised to see a lone figure walking toward them from the west, and dumbfounded to learn that he was a sheriff from Arkansas. "Did you come from California or where?" trail boss asked. He was an old white-mustached man named John, suspicious at first. Not many men came walking out of Texas. But July soon persuaded the old man to sell him a horse. It was the worst horse in the remuda, but it was a horse. July gave $40 for it. The Johns outfit had no saddle to spare, but they did give him directions. They tried to get him to stay the night with them. They had been on the trail 6 weeks, and a stranger was welcome novelty. But once he was mounted, July felt a sense of hurry seize him. He ate with them, thanked them again, and left under a rising moon. 4 days later, sore from riding bareback on the little sharp-spined bay, he trotted into Dodge City.